Coverage now. California elections in the spotlight tonight. The recall of San Francisco's District Attorney Chesa Boudin and the Los Angeles mayor's race. In two of the nation's most liberal large cities, votes are expected to send stinging messages of discontent over upticks in crime and homelessness.
CBS 13's Ed O'Keefe is joining us live now with more on this. First up, Ed, the L.A. mayor's candidates, they are in the spotlight today. What can you tell us about this race and why it's getting so much attention across the nation today?
Well, happy primary, guys. We love coming to California to cover these things. And L.A., of course, indicative of a lot of big city trends. In this case, the fact that two Democrats, one more liberal, one only recently joining the party, battling it out over questions of crime and homelessness and how to tackle them. And, you know, the old adage is, as politics go in California, they can eventually go across the country. So if Rick Caruso, the billionaire, former Republican turned Democrat, who has spent $40 million on TV advertising to suggest he can more effectively battle crime and homelessness, can at least keep it competitive with a liberal longtime Congresswoman Karen Bass, it's a sign that perhaps after several years of more critical talk about policing and how to deal with law and order issues, voters may be telling Democrats it's time to come back to the middle.
So let's head up the 101 from where you are to go to San Francisco now. District Attorney Chesa Boudin facing a recall. Voters fed up with brutal attacks against seniors, brazen burglaries. We've seen them, smash and grabs. So how likely is a recall?
If you look at recent surveys, it suggests that he's in for a real dogfight tonight. And again, another example of a big city who elected somebody vowing to reform the police, getting called on it by constituents in a way that only California really does it, by recalling them. And I think what's most notable in this race, that especially people outside the state may not appreciate, is the anger and concern, especially in the city's Asian American community, after all those attacks on residents in that city, and the concern that the DA's office isn't doing enough to focus on crimes like that and other petty theft and other issues that have come up. But again, indicative of the changes that were made in the wake of protests and the death of George Floyd a few years ago, and now residents realizing that with all the crime and growing rates of homelessness and other concerns about urban issues, they may be looking for somebody who's a little more focused aggressively on those kinds of issues. All that, plus the competitive congressional races that'll give us a sense of the balance of power in the House next year, depending on how Democrats and Republicans fare in those races across the state tonight, give us big reason to focus on California from outside the Golden State.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting night indeed, but it is interesting because you mentioned, you know, the anger and the outrage from citizens and voters, yet we're seeing record low numbers so far in terms of early voting. What are some of the reasons for the low turnout, do you think?
If you listen to local officials, they say, look, you know, many still don't realize that the way California conducts these open primaries is you could settle it all today if you really wanted to. And candidates, to some extent, also perhaps haven't really tried to build their campaigns that way. You know, habitually, Americans aren't necessarily used to holding elections or showing up to vote in the summer. So that is part of the challenge, especially in a non-presidential year. But we'll see what turnout is like in the races here in L.A., in San Francisco, how lower turnout can affect some of these congressional races like in the Central Valley, and whether that means that certain incumbents perhaps don't do as well or come up second. And what it might tell us about November, when, of course, not only Californians, but all Americans are more accustomed to casting ballots.
And it'll be here before you know it. Ed O'Keefe live in L.A. Thank you for the insight and the reporting tonight.